Hello, everyone. I bid you welcome. My name is Linda Maisels, and I'm the Managing Director of the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism. I am so pleased to welcome you to our event today, which is titled Antisemitism in Anglophone Countries. Before we begin, however, a small apology. I am aware that the title of this event is somewhat problematic. I'm aware of that because I was told by several people. All three of the countries represented today are linguistically and culturally diverse. The choice of the title was my, well, perhaps somewhat clumsy way of creating a loose theme for the webinar. Someone actually suggested to me this morning that I could have called it Anti-Semitism in Commonwealth countries, and particularly because King Charles is in the United States today, that might have been more appropriate. Anyway, my apologies, this one is certainly on me. Fortunately, I know that our esteemed guests today will help me to redeem myself. We have three outstanding scholars with us to engage in discussion, and hoping they will come on camera for a moment. From Canada, we have Professor Ron Levi from the University of Toronto. From Australia, Professor David Slucki from Monash University. And from South Africa, we have Emeritus Professor Milton Shain from the University of Cape Town. As for the format of the event, each of our speakers will have 15 to 20 minutes to discuss manifestations of contemporary anti-Semitism in their respective countries. At the end of all three presentations, we will open up for questions. Please note that the chat function is disabled, just as in all IPSA webinars, but you can place your questions in the Q&A and I will read them aloud, or our guests will be able to read them themselves. So, without further ado, let me move on to our first speaker. Milton Shain is Emeritus Professor of Historical Studies at the University of Cape Town. He has written, co-authored, and co-edited over a dozen books on South African Jewish history, South African politics, and the history of anti-Semitism. His latest book, Fascists, Fabricators, and Fantasists, Anti-Semitism in South Africa from 1948 to the Present, came out in 2023 and is the final volume in his trilogy on the history of anti-Semitism in South Africa. Milton, it's wonderful to have you today, and I now turn the floor over to you.
Thanks very much for the introduction, and nice to meet the other panelists. South Africa only had a Jewish question in the full sense in the 30s and 40s. That's when far white right Afrikaner folkish movements proliferated and peddled anti-Jewish conspiracies such as the protocols and called for programmatic action against Jews. That's to say they called for limitations on Jewish rights, on Jewish business, professional opportunities, and so forth. At that time, Jews numbered about 90,000. That's 4.5% of the white population, who were a minority anyway. It's important to note that we know very little at that time about black attitudes towards Jews. The struggle was really a black-white struggle, and liberation was the issue. Color was the cardinal divide. The calls for programmatic actions in the 30s and 40s, heavily influenced by European fascism, rapidly evaporated after the Second World War, when the National Party came into power and got the political and economic kingdom, and they no longer saw the Jew as subversive or as a competitive threat. That's not to say there was no anti-Semitism between 1948 and 1990, when effectively the new South Africa was born, but there were episodes of Jew hatred. Stereotypes persisted. Holocaust denial, for example, reared itself from time to time, and Jews were associated with communism and liberalism, both words of opprobrium in the apartheid lexicon. Far-right voices against Jews grew louder with greater intensity as the blunt edges of apartheid were smoothed from the 1970s and into the 80s, and as the prospects for a negotiated settlement gained ground. I should also note that during the apartheid years, there are indications, very few studies, but there are indications that the black population had imbibed anti-Jewish stereotypes, but the black-white divide remained paramount. In democratic South Africa today, I mean, subsequent to the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990 and the normalization of South African politics and society, South Africa enjoys cultural rights and religious freedom, all constitutionally enshrined, while church and state are separated. More than that, South Africa's rainbow nation celebrates diversity and difference. And importantly, hate speech is proscribed within the post-apartheid constitution. I should also note that successful cases have been brought against Jew haters. For all that, anti-Jewish stereotypes have survived in the new democratic South Africa. Survey, Global Attitudes Survey reported that South Africans, along with Spaniards, Mexicans, and Brazilians, harbored some of the most negative views of Jews outside the Muslim world. 46% of respondents regarded Jews in a very unfavorable or somewhat unfavorable light. And of those, 2/3 disliked Jews in the extreme. 6 years later, an ADL survey confirmed the prevalence of widespread anti-Jewish attitudes. Similar findings emerged in 2016 when a survey was done at UCT, where those similar stereotypes were prevalent across the country. In 2019, another survey undertaken by the ADL found South Africa to be second only to Poland in the rankings of hostile attitudes towards Jews, with nearly 1 in 2 South Africans apparently viewing Jews in an unfavorable light. Predictably, social media, especially at times of conflict in the Middle East, is filled with vile anti-Jewish comment. Yet it's noteworthy that anti-Jewish incidents have been relatively few in number, although they do rise during times of Middle East conflict. I'm talking about assault and damage and desecration to Jewish property or abusive behavior, verbal insults, threats, offensive gestures, hate mail, responses in social media, written threats, demonstrations, that sort of thing emerges when there's conflict in the Middle East, or it rises very notably. Most of the attacks are in social media. Typically, community members supportive of Israel have received hate mail, often including explicit threats. From our point of view this afternoon, it's important to note the penetration of anti-Semitic tropes into anti-Zionist discourse. We saw this most vividly in 2001 in Durban, in this UN World Conference Against Racism that turned effectively into a hate fest. I'm sure many of you know that the protocols of the Elders of Zion were on sale and Jews were harassed at every opportunity. It was a real turning point with a global impact. But the hatred or the hostility towards Zionism as an idea has been long in the making. For intellectuals in the African National Congress, the ANC, the leading party, and its allies, the idea of an ethnic state is anathema. It needs to be remembered that the liberation movements opposed the politics of ethnicity. For them, the proposed puppet homelands in apartheid South Africa were a means of divide and rule. This visceral suspicion of ethnicity, or what they understood as tribalism, went back to the ANC's 1955 Freedom Charter. Intellectuals informed by Marxian thought and influenced by the Soviet Union, for them Zionism was characterized as a form of racism, while Israel was defined very early on as a colonial settler apartheid state, an outpost of the West. This was put very bluntly in 1988 by the ANC's representative at the UN. This is when they were still in exile. He put it as follows: the South African people have never approved of Zionism. They see parallels of apartheid in Zionism, and therefore their struggle against apartheid automatically has overtones of anti-Zionism, which is not the same thing as being anti-Jewish. But other factors went into the mix. In exile, the ANC had close ties to the PLO and generally shared an anti-Western third worldist worldview. The close ties between Pretoria and Jerusalem from the 70s didn't help. In the early 1960s, Israel spoke out at the UN against apartheid South Africa, but it changed as both countries became pariahs and they got close together through the 70s, and that won't be forgotten. In addition to that, the Muslim influence seems to me to be very important. It's a small minority, around about 2% of the population, relatively well educated, and they have played an important role in bringing the attention of Zionism into the public space. That community has radicalized since the 1970s, when a younger generation challenged the quiescence of their conservative elders. It was evident in the founding of numerous movements where programs were introduced, manuals were printed, material provided for Islamist groups targeting Zionism, secularism, capitalism, and communism, seen as major threats to Islam. The impact of the Soweto uprising of 1976, the overthrow of the Shah in Iran in 79, and generally Islamist influences added to this radicalization. As I said, anti-Jewish tropes crept into anti-Zionist discourse. Let me give you an example of a couple of incidents, and this is at the highest levels. In 2008-9, during Operation Cast Lead, South Africa's Deputy Foreign Minister told a mainly Muslim audience in Johannesburg that the United States and Western countries were, and I'm quoting, in the hands of Jewish money. And when Jewish money controls, you can expect anything. And this conflation continued well after that operation. In 2012, the Deputy Foreign Minister called on South Africans not to visit Israel, while our largest trade union, COSATU, went so far as to describe the South African Zionist Federation as having hands, quote, dripping in blood. And similar accusations with another Hamas war in 2014. In a particularly ugly communication, a very prominent ANC politician called on Jewish leaders supporting Zionism to leave the country. I'm quoting now, if the Jewish Board of Deputies wants to advance a Zionist agenda, they should leave South Africa and go and advance their agenda elsewhere. This gentleman even advised and threatened to close down Jewish-owned businesses. In another hostile statement, a very senior ANC man, which according to international law and several UN conventions is a crime against humanity. In terms of our discussion this afternoon, I need to stress that for many, Israel has become a center of a vast conspiracy, nefariously manipulating global and South African politics and public finance. In the words of a prominent Palestine Solidarity Committee activist, a leader, he said the following in 2014: "The powerful tentacles of Zionist power and influence reaches into the commanding heights of our economy, and the ANC government, through business arrangements and patronage, including President Zuma and family members, are under their control." So that sort of statement links seamlessly with the long history of Jew hatred, and of course facilitated today by electronic media, the internet, hateful sites, and so forth. But it's important to note that the ANC and other anti-Zionists would deny any charge of anti-Semitism. And it's true that ANC politicians have from time to time condemned crude Jew hatred. But sensitivity towards undisguised Jew hatred in anti-Zionist discourse is ignored. And things have only worsened since 7 October. Much of the hostility transcends the normal bounds of political conflict. If the late historian Gavin Langmuir is correct to claim that fantasy is the hallmark of anti-Semitism, then it is difficult not to see at least some anti-Zionist discourse as a hygienic form of Jew hatred. Consider the following words of Imtiaz Suleiman, who was recently awarded an honorary doctorate at the University of Cape Town. There were some objections, but it went ahead. And he was awarded this honorary doctorate for the work of Gift of the Givers, an international disaster response organization he founded in 1992. Speaking to a well-heeled Muslim audience at a Business Achievers event in October 24, Suleiman had this to say, and I shall quote, "Every time we protested, the Zionists were too clever. They were arrogant, acting with impunity, putting fear into you. They put fear into corporations, into universities, into communities, into governments, into political parties, into associations. They run the world with fear. They control the world with money. And every time you say something, they terrify you and they say it's anti-Semitic. But I've got a message for them. Find a new narrative. This one is dull, boring, and stupid." As I heard tonight in a lecture, inaugural lecture, it's important to note that Suleiman chose to use a very particular set of tropes that have a long anti-Semitic history about money, power, subversion, fear-mongering, manipulation, conspiracy. Why draw on those particular tropes? He could have framed it in a different way, his hostility to what's going on in the Middle East. So it seems to me that wherever one stands on the spectrum of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, these sorts of tropes and many others are a mutation of age-old anti-Semitism, the latest iteration of the longest hatred. Today it presents itself as a Zionist problem. The meaning of this became abundantly clear recently when a young Jewish cricketer was made captain of South Africa's under-19 national team. Soon after 7 October at a Jewish function, he publicly praised the IDF. There was a national outcry. His captaincy was removed. The reality is that he could captain South Africa as a Jew, but not as a Zionist. So the anti-Zionism is deep. It'll be denied. Classical anti-Semitism is frowned upon, but Zionism is up for attack. Today, the South African Jewish community numbers less than 50,000 or 0.08% of the total population. It's a community overwhelmingly Zionist, and it's a community that's extremely uncomfortable. Thank you.
Milton, thank you so much. Sobering, particularly to hear the conspiratorial elements of what you're witnessing. Thank you. Our next speaker is David Slucki, who is the director of the Australian Centre for Jewish Civilization and the Lotis Morgan Associate Professor of Contemporary Jewish Life and Culture at Monash University. He is a historian who has written widely on Jewish life and culture after the Holocaust and is an expert on anti-Semitism and Jewish life and culture in Australia. He is project lead for the Monash Initiative for Rapid Research into Anti-Semitism and co-leads Monash's Campus Cohesion Project with Dr. Susan Carland. David, before you start, let me just remind our viewers that if you have questions, feel free to put them now into the Q&A. And with that, David, you're on.
Thank you so much, Linda, and thanks so much for the invitation. And it's wonderful to appear alongside Milton and Ron. What a huge honor! So I'm very humbled. If anyone's joining from Australia, thank you for getting up early at 6:20 in the morning here. So we're still waking up and it's still dark outside. So I just want to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the land of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, and I want to pay my respects to elders, past and present. And it's really important to me always, particularly when I'm talking in an international forum, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country that I live and work and raise my family on. There are sort of difficult overlapping violent histories in this place, and the impact of colonization is still so keenly felt in Australia. And so, I always have that in the back of my mind. So what I want to do today in about 15 or so minutes is give you a picture of the situation in Australia. And to do that, I want to start by going by way of giving a bit of a background of who Australian Jews are, because I think I lived in the US for 7 years, and people were usually baffled to even know that there were Jews in Australia, let alone such a robust Jewish community. And so I thought it would be a good way to start just by giving a little overview so you can sort of see, just thinking about how Milton just finished his talk then about the sort of tiny proportion of the population that Jews comprise in South Africa. There's similarities in Australia that I think are pertinent. Um, so there's about 117,000 Jews in Australia, according to the 2021 census. That is roughly 0.46% of the total population. So less than 0.5% of the total population. We are principally concentrated in the two biggest cities in Australia, Melbourne and Sydney. So of that 117,000, something like 90 to 95,000 live in those two cities. There's a small community in Perth, somewhere between 6 and 10,000, depending on who you ask. And then smaller smatterings in other cities and in rural and regional areas. But the Australian Jewish community is very densely concentrated. So in Melbourne, where I live, for example, something like 80% of of Victorian Jews live within 4 local government areas. Basically, 80% of Victoria's Jews live within 5 kilometers of where I'm sitting right now, or miles for the North American folks. 3 miles from where I'm sitting. So we're very densely concentrated and in lots of ways very invisible to the population at large. We don't have the same kind of public, media presence as in the US. There are certain sectors where Australian Jews do tend to be more prominent. But if you ask, which I do regularly in workshops on anti-Semitism, when I ask people to name the most famous Jews they can think of, it's usually like Seinfeld and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It doesn't tend to be Australian Jews because we just don't necessarily have that same visibility. Although I will say that the university that I proudly work at, Monash University, is named for probably one of Australia's historically most important Jews, Sir John Monash, who was an engineer and a general in the Australian Army during World War One. Australian Jews tend to be um, Orthodox leaning, but not Orthodox per se. So about 1/5 of Australian Jews identify either as modern Orthodox or Haredi. That's a tiny proportion. And then the vast majority are traditional or secular, sort of going to shul a few times a year. And the shul that the old joke, the shul that I don't go to has to be Orthodox. That kind of that's the most typical profile of Jewish Australians. Um, so again, it sort of adds to the invisibility of Jews that most of us, you might be able to say I'm wearing kippah, but most Australian Jews aren't visibly or identifiably Jewish, which I think is probably comparable in Canada, the US, South Africa. Um, Historically, anti-Semitism in Australia hasn't been a widespread or violent problem. Like there's always been anti-Semitism, before World War II, anti-Semitism was, that kind of British polite anti-Semitism. Jews were barred from polite society. There was resistance to immigration of Jews, even Holocaust survivors. And then, particularly in the post-Holocaust period, there was a kind of small far-right movement, neo-Nazis in the inner cities. But and that the wave of post-war European migration also brought Nazis or Nazi collaborators from Ukraine, Lithuania, and the Baltic countries and elsewhere. And so there was a kind of core, underlying anti-Semitism that usually operated in the shadows, and it was pretty hidden. It was kind of more a curiosity than a widespread threat. Things started to change somewhat in the 1990s, partly because of the greater visibility of the Holocaust. We had a museum established in Melbourne in 1984, one in Sydney not long after. Um, the Schindler's List coming to Australia brought the Holocaust to the public consciousness, and that kind of brought this reverse sort of backlash where Holocaust denial became more prominent. There was a quite a prominent global Holocaust denier in Adelaide who ran what he called the Adelaide Institute. And so those existed in the margins, but they weren't mainstream. Most people didn't know from Jews, and that was probably if we look at the last few years, that was probably for the best. Um, Things have escalated as the same as Milton said in South Africa. Whenever conflict escalates in the Middle East, that leads to heightened anti-Semitism and heightened threat in Australia. If you walk around the Jewish neighborhoods of Melbourne and Sydney and Perth, what you'll see is, un what's very unusual in Australia is very fortified communities. So, the schools, the institutions, synagogues all now have an increasingly higher fences, um, bollards out the front to prevent cars driving into them, armed security guards, things that in other places might be normal. I think in South Africa, these things are more normal. In Latin America, these things tend to be more normal. But in Australia, when you go to a Jewish school and then you walk half a block down past the Catholic school, the difference is really noticeable in the sense of threat that people feel and the kind of things that they're scared of and worried about. So there is this heightened sense in Australia of threat that sort of underlies, particularly the last few years, but even going back further. Partly that's because of a rise in anti-Semitism. Partly it's because I think we're predominantly a post-Holocaust community. So we do in Australia, there is a hypervigilance among the Jewish community that I think results from the centrality of the Holocaust in our sort of foundational narratives. Um, okay, I want to talk now about the post October 7 landscape because it really was a turning point in lots of ways. Discussion about anti-Semitism was a bit of a curiosity. And I'll just give an example. When I took over as director of my center about 3.5 years ago, I had this idea that we should get a PhD scholarship for someone to write about anti-Semitism in Australia. And I thought that was a pretty good ambition. And there'd be some philanthropist who would be interested in it and, like really, you know, get a bit more scholarship in the field. Now I oversee an initiative that has about 4 researchers working on it, plus a team of professionals who sort of translate the research, and we run trainings. And basically, what became really clear in the really the weeks and months after October 7 is that what we were talking about is no longer a curiosity. What we're talking about is really a kind of concrete threat that we didn't understand well enough. There's been lots of good research into the history of Australian Jews. there's been less focused research on anti-Semitism in Australia, except as a subset of that Australian Jewish historiography. So what we set about doing with our work was to try and better understand the situation. Um, and it was, almost immediate in Australia that we saw a bit of we saw an outburst of anti-Semitism. So on October 9th, and you might have seen, these are the kind of things that I think got broadcast widely, scenes outside the iconic Sydney Opera House where protests against Israel on October 9th, 2023, erupted, and they were accompanied by groups. So not only was there protest against Israel in the wake of attacks on Israel, um, but in those protests at the Sydney Opera House, there were, chants of "Where's the Jews?" And clearly in a kind of threatening way, like, that they maybe want to attack or lynch Jews in the vicinity. The big public debate came around what they actually said. Did the video capture them saying "gas the Jews" or, excuse my French, but "fuck the Jews"? And it turns out, they were saying "Where's the Jews?" as though that's also okay. So that, is an example of where anti-Semitism, what I would say is for a lot of the last couple of years, anti-Semitism hasn't been taken particularly seriously. Um, Jews have felt it very keenly, or many Jews have felt it very keenly. Um, but because I think of our invisibility, because of the perceived, and this is a really complicated notion, but because of the perceived whiteness of Jews in Australia, because Australian Jews are perceived to be all wealthy and powerful, which obviously is another anti-Semitic trope in itself. But because of those factors, I think people never took the threat to the Jewish community seriously until there were certain kinds of very violent outbursts. So in December 2024, the Adass Israel Synagogue, which is, maybe 3 or 4 kilometers from my house, I should say there's in Melbourne alone, there's about 50 congregations among, or more than 50 congregations among the 50 or so thousand Jews. So there's something for everyone. But the Adass Israel Synagogue, which is a Hasidic synagogue, was firebombed in the middle of the night, about 3 or 4 a.m. Um, there were a couple of people inside the building. No one was hurt, but the synagogue itself was destroyed. And a lot of the Torah scrolls and the books and all the stuff inside the synagogue were destroyed. Um, that was against the backdrop of sort of targeted attacks, particularly in Sydney at the time, against Jewish institutions, things like cars being firebombed. The former house of the CEO of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry was targeted for firebombing as well. It actually was his previous address, but anti-Semites aren't always the smartest in the room. Um, so there was kind of this escalation at that time in those last months of 2024 that saw the Adass synagogue firebombing. That sparked a national conversation in a way that we hadn't seen in the year previously. The government committed tens of millions of dollars to enhancing security measures in Jewish institutions. So if you drive around the Jewish community now, you see a lot more of this particular kind of fence that governments have paid for in Jewish institutions, more airlocks, more security cameras, more funding for the community security group, um, basically increased fortification of the Jewish community as a result. And in a way, Adass was a soft target because it didn't have the same kind of enhanced security as most Jewish institutions. The irony, of course, is, being a Hasidic synagogue, it's not, overtly or outwardly Zionist. And yet it was the target, likely because it had Israel in the name. We found out late last year that the attack was engineered by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, So it was a foreign attack on Australian soil, on an Australian Jewish community. Um, Many people saw that as kind of vindication that it wasn't a homegrown attack. I thought it was kind of terrifying, actually, the fact that foreign governments were now attacking the Jewish community in Australia. So that was the first sort of like really, to that point, the worst attack on Australian Jewish institutions. Then a year later, at a Hanukkah celebration on the iconic Bondi Beach in Sydney, two gunmen massacred 15 people at a Hanukkah on the beach celebration. Um, and that's been a turning point in two ways, I would say. The first the first thing is it brought the reality of anti-Semitism really plainly to the surface. Jews were now not just, that there was no way to say, well, we're just talking about hurt feelings or we're just talking about criticism of Israel, which is, often the pushback when people deny anti-Semitism is a factor. Now what we had was the worst attack on Australian Jews in history, the only mass killing of Australian Jews, and also the first mass shooting in Australia in 30 years. We just this week had the anniversary of the last mass shooting, which happened in Tasmania, which was more random than this, not targeted. So people kind of had to confront the fact that, this was the reality that Jews lived with now, that, it was possible that celebrating Judaism was enough to put you in danger, which was, really sobering for many people who really couldn't grasp the reality of that. Flip side of what happened after Bondi, though, was an absolute spike in anti-Semitism. So for people who are chronically online, and that's not me, but I'm a little bit online, what I witnessed was an absolute surge in anti-Semitic rhetoric online. Um, because what happened was, firstly, it put Jews on the front page of the newspapers as victims. And so, when people in Australia know about Jews now, it's only either as victims or as, loud, demanding, powerful people, billionaires or business people who are, seen to be pulling the strings of power. That's how people see Jews in Australia now. They don't typically see us as just ordinary everyday Australians because we're invisible in those ways. So there's a surge in anti-Semitism. What the other outcome was, the government, after a few weeks of public pressure, the government called a royal commission into anti-Semitism and social cohesion. A royal commission, for those in North America, is a government-initiated kind of investigation or inquiry that will make recommendations, and it's normally only the most serious things warrant a royal commission. So Bondi sparked a royal commission, and again, in turn, that came to be characterized by many people on both the left and right as a sort of indication of the power of the Jewish lobby, or as they say, the Zionist lobby. Um, they're going to hand out their interim report today, literally today, Australian time. We're going to see an interim report, which is going to look at, they've had in the last couple of months 3,500 submissions, and so that's going to focus on the lived experiences, particularly of Australian Jews, and also looking at the lead up to Bondi, the security situation. What were the mistakes along the way that allowed for a Bondi to happen? So those are some of the biggest, those are the two, I would say, biggest incidents. But anti-Semitism is broader. So we've borrowed from British researchers when we talk about ambient anti-Semitism in Australia. That is the idea that anti-Semitism is kind of atmospheric, or it's in the air. And that's Linda. I see you've come on screen. You're giving me the wind up. So I'll just wrap up really quickly on this point around the way ambient anti-Semitism affects Australian Jews. Our work with our initiative, we're doing predominantly qualitative research. So we're doing interviews, focus groups. We're trying to get in-depth stories of people on the ground. So we're going sector by sector to understand what's it like to be a Jew in the arts sector, in higher education. We're currently looking at the healthcare sector. And what we're finding is not universally, but in particular sectors, the atmosphere is really difficult for Jews. So I'll just finish with this example of Jews in the arts, in the cultural and creative industries, where increasingly Jews who demonstrate any attachment to Israel whatsoever are being doxxed, harassed, bullied. Um, they're not getting commissions, they're not getting awards, they're not getting um, book prizes, they're not publishers are not publishing their work when previously they had been. You know, there's been a big shift in the sense that Jewish stories can be told. And so the arts sector is one area where we've found, there is a huge problem, and we talk about ambient anti-Semitism there. Um, I'll finish by saying this. Many Australian Jews are feeling vulnerable and threatened, and I still think Australia is probably one of the best places in history to live as a Jew. So in lots of ways, it is a complicated situation because Australia is still, a multicultural country that is grappling with many forms of discrimination, and anti-Semitism has come to the fore in recent years. I try and be hopeful and Pollyanna-ish about the prospects for the future, and I hope that the work we do in my centre will have some impact in shifting the dial. So thanks so much again for having me. And again, I'm so grateful to be alongside Milton and Ron, and thanks to you, Linda, for having me, and particular thanks to Inessa for making this all happen.
David, thank you so much. I can't imagine what it was like to be in Australia, excuse me, on when with the shooting at Bondi Beach. I think it was a metaphorical gut punch for many of us around the world, and we, truly stood with you in every way. And that was one of the many motivations for me to put together this webinar. So thank you, and thank you for getting up so early. Um, a quick reminder, I see we have some questions in the Q&A. Please, you can address your question to one of our speakers or to all three of them, and we will open up for Q&A after our next speaker. And that is Ron Levi, who is professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto, where he is Distinguished Professor of Global Justice. He directs a lab in the Munk School on justice systems under stress and the Lab for the Global Study of Anti-Semitism in the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies. So, Ron, thank you so much for joining us, and the camera is yours.
Thank you, Linda. And I have to start by saying I spent all of David's talk and Milton's talk trying to rewrite my talk, wondering, how am I going to address these questions because they're so pertinent to the Canadian experience as well. And so, off the top of my head, I'm wondering, should I be telling people in the room? In the Zoom room, about the structure of Canadian Jewry, which looks a lot more like Australia than it does in many ways than it does like the US in terms of a somewhat more conservative, more Orthodox community, though I think the Orthodox pull is a bit higher in Australia. David will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that that's right. There's a sense articulated in the media as well as in the community in Canada, certainly in Toronto, and I'll explain why I say that in a second, that Bondi Beach there's a concern that will Bondi happen here is often articulated that way, and that was our intelligence services in Canada said that was a possibility, a realistic possibility, which then of course encouraged those concerns and motivated those concerns. But I think that part of the thinking around Bondi in Canada has also been that structurally the communities share a lot of similarities. I wasn't going to go through the history of anti-Semitism in Canada, though I think, as Milton was saying, these anti-Semitism in Canada has certainly had its peaks and valleys, including around political conflict, not always around conflict in the Middle East. And so the example that came to mind as Milton was speaking was in 1995 when the Quebec Sovereignist or Separatist Party of the Parti Québécois lost a referendum on sovereignty just by a smidgen, 50.5%, right? So that came very close in that sense. The premier at the time in Quebec, who functioned as a state governor or prime minister of a province, um, blamed right after the loss that night money and ethnic votes. And that was widely interpreted to include, at minimum, to include Jews. And so there's always been these moments in that sense. I will say, though, I said that was similar to Australia. There are two dimensions coming to the Anglophone country piece that I think is important to understand for Canada. The first is that the best estimates I've seen are a third to 40%, something like this, of the Jewish community in Quebec is Sephardic or Mizrahi. And that's a real, I mean, I'm part of that community. That is a in the main, post 1970s, 80s phenomenon. And so there's a linguistic difference there. There's also a historical difference in terms of trajectories of Jewish communities. And I'll say that the best estimate I've seen in, say, the Toronto context is that about a quarter, hard to know, but about a quarter of the Toronto Jewish community is either and Russian and or Israeli. And so there's a trajectory at this point, and that's quite recent. And so these communities are also changing and changing in terms of their histories, changing in terms of their experience with anti-Semitism and their capacity and gauge of the issue. So I'm going to share my screen because in addition to being the newest kid, I think, on the block in terms of thinking about these issues on this panel. I also am a bit of a pedant because I tend to rely on data, I think, a lot more. And so I hope everyone can see my screen. Linda will pop on if you cannot. But since Linda has not popped on, it seems like you can. This was a piece that some of you may have seen on the right in The Atlantic, which came out just end of March of this year, referring to what the author, who's a Canadian journalist, called Canada's Polite Pogrom. The subtitle is in a national tolerance, is a national tolerance for well, is national tolerance for purging Jews from public life? That became the question. On the left, blacked out because it's a colleague and a friend, was a note from an American colleague, a US colleague, who just wrote, "That bad?" Right? And so I don't know that I'm in a position to assess that bad or not that bad, but I'd like to draw out some of what was in the Atlantic piece to see what we can learn about anti-Semitism in the current moment in Canada. So just some baseline so you have a sense. Canada is a far more tight-knit Jewish community in just by virtue of size. And so I say that as a non-expert in that question, but we have about 400,000 Jews in Canada compared to, you see the numbers, obviously, for the United States. The estimates by Bob Brim, who's a close colleague, who's Canada's dean, I would say, of surveys of Canadian Jewry, is that this will soon take over or flip with France as French Jews leave because of emigration or emigrate out of France, and Canadian Jewry grows through immigration. We're likely to be the second largest diaspora at that point. Most Canadian Jews live in Toronto. And that's what you see at the bottom, with about half of that, just under half of that in Montreal, the rest of Canada being the remainder. That's mostly in provinces like British Columbia, so cities like Vancouver, and provinces like Alberta, cities like Edmonton and Calgary. In general, and this is these are Bob Brim's data. This is a recent survey from 2025. If you collapse all the dimensions of favorable feelings about Jews, about 3/4 of Canadians surveyed, right? This is a survey of a few thousand Canadians, nationally representative, and Bob finds that about 3/4 of his respondents have favorable sentiments about Jews in Canada, right? And about 12% have unfavorable. The rest don't know. And so we can ask what don't know or didn't answer, don't know means, but that's a pretty high number. And when you get to Israelis, that falls. I don't want to make the implication that all Israelis are Jews, but when you get to Israelis, that falls to about 58% compared to 73%, but still above other groups, including in this case Palestinians and Muslims. Right? So let me tell you parts of the current landscape. I spent many years of my life as a criminologist, and so if you just look at the crime data, which has its own limitations, and you look at anti-Jewish hate crimes, these are reported hate crimes, and these are filtered through the police, right? So in that sense, these data are official data coming from police forces with all of the caveats that includes. You see an uptick in anti-Jewish hate crimes in Canada. You see that enormous uptick post October 7th. 2020 is probably the wrong year to start with because that's a COVID year that's artificially low. But what you'll see is that there's an increase. And even when you compare it to other hate crimes, if you subtract Jews as victims of those hate crimes, you see that the gap for anti-Jewish hate crimes is nearly 3 times of the rise of non-Jewish hate crimes or hate crimes against other groups. That's true in Toronto. On the left, you can see hate crimes targeting Jews. That outstrips sorry, I apologize here. What you have on the left in green are all the hate crimes. What you see is the growing orange line or the rising orange line of hate crimes targeting Jews, right? So that's going up annually. The B'nai B'rith here does a community audit. That's a large number, coming to about 7,000. That came out just this week or last week for the current year. Those are reported by community members as opposed to police data. Those include online, and those are at the level of the person. So the same incident may generate more than one call in this sense or report. But that's, I think what's important here is you see the uptick. We have, as David was also saying, had shootings, vandalism, property damage against synagogues and schools. All of these here are, if I'm not mistaken, as I look at my notes here, these are all in Toronto proper. And so we'd have others as well in Montreal. But this is just, and you see the dates, and I put the dates there for a reason. They're right? Every few weeks, right? We see that kind of pattern. We had for a while, we had a special envoy for preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism, Deborah Lyons, who's there on the left. The special envoy commissioned a report, also done by my colleague Bob Brim, on anti-Semitic incidents against children in schools. These children run from kindergarten through grade 12, so there's a span there. They found about 800 anti-Semitic incidents that were reported when they did surveys with parents. But what's interesting here, what I'm hoping to point out, and it comes to the question that Milton and David were also bringing in about anti-Zionism, questions around Israel, is that 40% of the reports of anti-Semitic incidents in schools had nothing to do, or at least in their content, had nothing to do with either Israel or Zionism, right? So if you look here in the survey that Bob conducted and you ask the parents what were the incidents about a quarter of them were comments like Jews are cheap, Jews are vermin, David swore, so I'll swear too. Fuck you, Jews. Hitler should have finished the job, right? That's about a quarter of the reports. And you see the other 15% there as well. And then the remainder become expressions of negative attitudes toward Israel. So there's clearly more to it than only questions about Israel and questions about Zionism, though that too, and that too in the main. If you look then, and what I want to spend a fair bit of time on, are reactions and interpretations by Canadian Jews of these expressions of hate and of this anti-Semitism. The report outlined how many Jewish students chose not to report. Many Jewish students in this report reported hiding symbols of identity. This comes to David's point of who's visible and who's not, and the capacity to be invisible. Um, but I think the bigger point here that I want to point at is what parents reported they would do or did do in response to these incidents. And what you see, and I don't know if you can see it easily on your screen, but if you go about 6 lines down, you'll see that from English public schools, as opposed to French public schools, a very small number. So let's stick with the English public schools. The majority of responses of what people would do was that they were going to move their kids to Jewish private school. That's 37 kids out of the 95 who report on this. That's about a third of the reports on these 100 who responded to this, right? And so that tells us something about what's happening in the community. This is a report from the Canadian Jewish News that Toronto, as well as across Canada, Jewish schools are reporting a surge in enrollments. I know this well. My kids are in one of these schools, and so we see large numbers in classes. Can't tell you if that's all directly because of anti-Semitism, but surely that's being reported as part of the account. So let me then turn to reactions more generally. If we look at the Atlantic piece and we look through it carefully, a lot of what's reported in the Atlantic are the responses by Canadian Jews to expressions of anti-Semitism. About 80% of, I apologize, my dog is going to bark. Hold on. If only I knew that would happen. About 80% of Jewish doctors who were surveyed in Ontario by a Jewish Physician Association reported anti-Semitism at work post October 7th. About a third of Ontario's Jewish doctors haven't left, but reported in that same survey that they're considering leaving Canada because of hostile work environments. We have instances of a Jewish film festival that was postponed in Hamilton, which is a city outside Toronto, when the theater itself backed out, citing safety concerns for a Jewish film festival. We have reports of journalists leaving Canadian newspapers. We have a Senate report. We have an elected House of Commons and we have an appointed Senate, which works as a legislative body as well. We have a Senate report that just released its report on anti-Semitism, which is seeing anti-Semitism and defining anti-Semitism as a threat to Canadian democracy. And if we look at the committee evidence there too, what we're seeing are reports of how Canadian Jews are responding to incidents of anti-Semitism, which includes a sense that there's an attempted erasure of Jewish culture, tradition, and history. That's the first quote I have for you from a student. The second quote about how Jewish parents saying that Jewish students are opting to conceal their identity. Right by the time we get toward the bottom, we have medical residents refusing to work with their Jewish colleagues, and others, a congregation rabbi, saying that those wishing to advance feel that they need to conceal. This sense of how the community is responding to anti-Semitism also came up during some of the protests around the war in Gaza. This was Mount Sinai Hospital is a historically Jewish hospital, which obviously is now open to all, but was produced and was from the beginning, but was produced by the Jewish community in order to have places for Jewish patients and Jewish physicians and Jewish healthcare workers. When during a protest, the individual you see here, scaled Mount Sinai Hospital along with a Palestinian flag. This was responded to by our Prime Minister at the time, Justin Trudeau, saying he strongly condemned this display of anti-Semitism. The CEO of the hospital, um, and I think it's important here for the rest of what I want to tell you or share with you, is that the CEO of the hospital positioned this in relation to the past, in relation to the creation of this hospital by the Jewish community of Toronto over a century ago. And so what I want to, I guess, outline here is a sense a sense I have that the Jewish community is interpreting and seeing the anti-Semitism of today in Canada in relation to its sense of the Canada of old or a past Canada, right? You can call that nostalgia, which I don't mean in a sort of cynical way at all, right? But a longing for the past, a sense that things have changed, or a worry that things are changing. It's impossible for me to know which, right? So the Toronto Police Services Board, which oversees the police, did a consultation on what should the police be doing around the policing of public protest. People came out, not only Jewish respondents, but from the responses, one detects that a lot of them are invoking Jewish themes and representing themselves as Jews. People came out and submitted comments saying that police should be enforcing the law. They should not be allowing for hate speech. I should say, in relation to what Milton said about hate speech, the major hate speech cases in Canada have been in relation to Jews and Holocaust denial. And so there's a sense that hate speech laws worked in protecting the Jewish community. But what I did is I went through and I looked at all of the comments that were submitted to this committee of the Toronto Police Services Board asking about how it should police protest and what it should do better, what it should do differently. Fully a quarter of these submissions, which are presentist submissions, they're about today, invoke the past, right? So it wasn't surprising to me that people were coming out and talking about the rule of law, civil liberties, fairness, how to figure out the limits on that, how to allow for it, how to figure out security, all these balancing questions that one would expect. But a quarter referring to a kind of sense of the past struck me as surprising. And so I just went through and classified, both myself and then through a language model, what was being said, right? And these are the types of things that people were coming out to say. This isn't the Canada I knew. People invoked a quarter of those who spoke about the past, invoked their family being Holocaust survivors. Canada is a bit less than Australia, but not so differently. Also, a post-Holocaust community in many ways. I've lived here all my life. There's a sense of people's own life trajectories. The no longer is doing a lot of work here. Live openly as a Jew. That's about 10% of those who refer to the past, right? And so I can put these up. Uh, you can see them. You can watch them later online if you'd like. I've just pulled these from the responses to give you a sense of the things people were saying when they referred to the past in interpreting the anti-Semitism they were seeing today. This isn't the Canada I knew. They would bring up Holocaust accounts for those Jews who are direct descendants of Holocaust survivors. The resemblance to this era is felt strongly. What one individual says, "My parents' families moved to Canada to escape threats where we could be safe," right? And then concerns about no longer being able to live openly. I just want to end with a little bit more data. And again, I do apologize for being a bit of a pedant about these things, but I've been working with an NGO called Digital Public Square here in Canada and here in Toronto, and they've been doing these surveys and they've been sharing their data with me quite generously. And these are data that they have from polarization in Canada. And I think the similar theme comes up, and that's why I want to share it. If they ask people, and here they have them classified by religion, so you've got Christian respondents, Muslim respondents, Jewish respondents, or respondents that didn't report their religion. If you look at the red bar, the red vertical bar across each, Jews compared to the other groups, well, compared to Christians and Muslims in this case, are reporting a slightly lower, small, a slightly lower sense of belonging to Canada. They are reporting quite a bit lower feeling of liking being part of today's Canada when one compares that in this case to Muslim respondents, they're flat with Christian respondents. But the real gap happens with a sense of nostalgia about what Canada used to be. We don't know what people interpret that to mean, but when asked, do you agree with the following statements? 70% of Jewish respondents in the survey referred to being nostalgic about what Canada used to be. The 52% Muslim respondent is hard to interpret. I see Linda. The 52% Muslim respondent is hard to interpret. Those are often more recent immigrants to Canada, but compared to the 55 of Christian respondents, that seems to me quite meaningful. That nostalgia also seems to connect with other feelings among Jewish respondents in this survey. 55% say they don't feel they can express themselves in mainstream society. That's of Jewish respondents, I should say. And I think what's interesting here is that 50% of Jewish respondents also had the view that global conflicts, Ukraine, Gaza, don't really impact Canada. And I think, and here I'm imputing my own interpretation. I think when read that way, what is being said is shouldn't or ought not or don't really impact Canada. And so I think if we take all of these data pieces together, my gloss on it, my interpretation would be that Jewish respondents are expressing a higher amount of nostalgia. We see this even when being asked by police about how to police protest, are expressing a somewhat higher percentage of being unable to express themselves in mainstream society, which I think may also be about a nostalgia of what was, and maybe a sense of confusion about that because of a view that global conflicts don't really impact Canada. I can go on, and I won't because Linda has stopped me, but I want to just say one quick thing, which is a current concern that's happened this week, which is that there's been a concerted effort by different groups to try and have, sometimes successfully, the tax status or the charitable tax status of some Jewish organizations in Canada revoked. The Jewish National Fund Canada had its tax status revoked. That's being disputed in the federal courts. Some Jewish camps were there were groups trying to have their tax status revoked. The most recent one is to have the tax status of Canadian Jewish schools, in particular in Ontario, but also some in Quebec, also to have their tax status revoked. Um, I think what's interesting to me, I will stop here, Linda, is that that too is being seen as that that those actions are being seen as anti-Semitic also in light of a sense of the past, right? There's a coordinated campaign. These are by three major Ontario Jewish associations, Canadian and Ontario Jewish associations, saying there's a concerted campaign to erase Jewish life in Canada, and it's not only being waged through violence and intimidation. So the erasure seems to me that something is happening in interpreting this as changing the past, changing the status of Jews in Canada. At least that's how I'm interpreting it. I'll turn over to Linda. Thank you.
Ron, thank you so much. As with all the presentations, really sobering. Thank you. If I could have all of our participants please come back on camera. Um, I want to thank you all so much for your contributions. I know for me, it's interesting, and I assume that many other people online are doing the same thing. We're from the United States. The United States obviously takes up a lot of oxygen in discussions about anti-Semitism in the diaspora, and to compare and to think about the similarities and the differences, it's been fascinating. I could have had a full webinar with any one of you, but I'm pleased that I was able to bring you together today. I wanted to ask, well, before I ask if any of the three of you wish to ask questions of anyone else on the panel, I wanted to grab a question from our audience, from Monica. And this is really about Jewish reactions to anti-Semitism. So in the United States, many young progressive or liberal Jews are now identifying as anti-Zionist for many reasons, perhaps without an in-depth or nuanced understanding of what Zionism is or has been in its many interpretations. In some cases, when we're talking about nostalgia in the past, there's a glorification of the Bund and the idea of here-ness and embracing Jewish life in the diaspora. Are you finding that in the Jewish communities that you've spoken about? And Milton, if you would like to take this question first.
One can see a generational shift. There's no doubt a growing but insignificant in terms of real numbers of young intellectual Jews who've turned away from the Zionist idea, protesting, joining protests against Israel, more so than ever, but they're still a very small minority, but vocal. As far as the Jewish community as a whole, as I said, it's overwhelmingly Zionist, roots in Lithuania, which was strongly Zionist at the time when they came out of South Africa. So it's not a challenge to that. It's cemented the identification with Israel. but it has unhinged Jews. There's no doubt about it. We had a very comfortable ride in a sick society, apartheid South Africa, where we didn't have the shift in 67 with the new left in the United States or in Europe, where there were big question marks about occupation, etc. We never had that, so Jews were insulated. When the society opened up, newspaper ownership changed. From the early 90s, Jews were pummeled with an anti-Zionist critique to which they had been oblivious almost. And they toughened up and fought back in the media and so forth. But today it's a wall-to-wall struggle.
Thank you. David, would you like to take that?
Yes, I'm really glad for this question because in a previous life, I'm a historian by trade, and in a previous life, my focus was on the Bund and its ideas of Deutschland. I can recommend a couple of excellent books if you want to trace the history of that. Um, Look, it's funny. It's something I've been I'll get to the first part of Monica's question in a sec, but I just want to address this glorification of the Bund thing because it's something I've been talking about for probably, well, what I would say is I was talking about it before it was cool to talk about. But um, people have been sort of, I think what's happened with this kind of, it's not only the Bund and the Bundists, although that's like prominent, particularly in the US and some parts of Europe. Um, a lot of young Jews are kind of looking for what historians call a usable past. That is, one of the data points I point to in Australia, and I think this is true in like the Pew studies in the US, is declining levels of religious observance. It's no secret, but in the Australian context, we ran in 2017 we ran a major survey of Australian Jews. We're about to like in within weeks we're gonna put it out in the field again, which will be called Gen. The 2017 version was Gen 17. This will be Gen 26. Um, One of the questions was around, what of the following are important to your sense of Jewish identity? And the bottom four results, 46% believing in God, and then in the mid to low 30s were halakha, Jewish law, studying Jewish religious texts, and prayer. So the things that until the modern era have been kind of the foundational aspects of what it means to be Jewish are now vanishingly important to Jews in the West. And so that gets replaced by something, right? There's a vacuum that needs to be filled. And in a place like Australia, Zionism has been a big part of that. But for many Jews who don't see that as their kind of the anchor for their Jewishness, they sort of look for these other usable pasts. So the Bund, because I think because it's sort of grounded in a kind of thickness around what you do, right? It's like it's not only sort of social democratic politically, but it's also grounded in Yiddish language and culture, and it's not too distant in the past. People get connected to their grandparents, their great grandparents, so it's something you can kind of cling on to, and I think that's why there's this sort of attraction to the Bund and its idea of Deutschland. In terms of the generational shift that Milton pointed out to in South Africa, I think that's true in Australia too, but in a weird way, actually, because there is this, I don't know yet if it's growing, but certainly more vocal or bold kind of Jewish left when it comes to criticizing Israel or anti-Zionist. Um, but the sort of adjunct to that point, and when we do the Gen 26 survey, I'll be really interested to see the result here. But in Gen 20, in Gen 17, when asked, "Are you a Zionist?" 69% of Australian Jews marked yes. Um, and if you break that down by age group, the highest proportion was 18 to 29, which is kind of the opposite of what you might expect. And one of the reasons I think that's the case is I think this is true, and maybe someone correct me if it's not, but I think we have the highest rates of Jewish day school attendance of all Jewish communities. And the Jewish schools are Zionist, and so I think there's a kind of clear link between, the rate of Jewish day school attendance and attachment to Israel. Um, but yeah, it's a kind of like there is a dual, it's a dual thing going on because there is, we had the establishment of this organization that called themselves the Jewish Council of Australia, and that they came into being in probably November 2024, and they basically have tried to position themselves as the voice of the Jewish left, um, controversially so, and the name and everything. Um, but I don't know if it's growing or if it's just more visible and louder, that part of the Australian Jewish community. Sorry, can I just add one final thing on the Bund, and that is that I happen to live in the only city in the world where there still is a Bund organization, and I proudly grew up in its youth movement, and my son attends the youth movement today still.
That is fabulous. Thank you. Ron?
So Linda, that if you're going to ask me a question, I'm going to show a slide.
I'm
But
okay with that.
so so again, I take my cue from Bob Grimm, my colleague, right? And I think what's very important here, and what Bob has been calling semantic drift, is the question of what it means for young people, for anyone, but for young people in this case, to be thinking of themselves as anti-Zionists, or non-Zionists or anti-Zionists. And so Bob asked different questions, right? He asked, if you look at the right-hand panel, do you believe Israel has the right to exist as a Jewish state? Even those respondents who saw themselves not as Zionists tended in the main, quite high, to believe that Israel had the right to exist as a Jewish state. And so something like 90 odd percent, some numbers move a little bit, high 80s to mid 90s to about 92% of Canadian Jews see themselves as Zionist. Um, uh, but in a recent survey that Bob was responding to, about 40 to 50% were saying that they didn't think of themselves as um, I apologize. 90 odd percent see themselves as believing in a Jewish state, and about 40 to 50% were saying that they weren't Zionist. And so that's where Bob was saying, well, what's happening here? And his findings were that the question of the semantics of am I a Zionist, and the question of whether you believed in a Jewish state were becoming decoupled. Is how he was thinking about it. So I think other than that, I would my guess is that things look on the ground like David's saying here in Canada as well. I will say that in the fall, I'll be doing interviews, and I hope maybe I can bring David over to help me with them. But I'll be doing interviews with Jewish students at my university to discuss their experiences on campus, but also their trajectories academically and professionally, to think through how they think of obstacles and opportunities. So I'm hoping I'll learn quite a bit about how young Jews on campus are thinking about Zionism and about Israel at the same time.
Ron, I'm happy to come, just not in the winter, please. Because I did that already.
Fair enough.
This is fabulous. Here we are at IPSA making connections with everyone. Thank you all for your answers. I see that we have about 9 minutes left, so I have two more questions I want to fit in. I wanted to have you guys ask each other questions, but we've got some interesting ones. This question is specifically for Milton. How is community attrition? How does this look in South Africa, and to what countries are South African Jews leaving? Milton?
South African Jews have been on the run starting massacre. In those days, in the 60s, they went mainly to England. From the 70s, there was always a group going to Israel, I should say. But from the 70s began a trickle to Australia, which picked up in the 80s. Canada also picked up then. Israel constant, and the United States by the 80s, 90s. So those are the destinations: Israel, the United States, Australia, which is significant, and David will confirm that, and Canada. The attrition has not harm Jewish life in any way. It's very vibrant. A city like Cape Town has an enormous amount of things going on with the Jewish population about 15,000, 1 5. Johannesburg probably has 30,000 today. At its height, it was over 60,000. But the small towns, the rural parts, and even the middle grade towns, they are denuded of Jews today. So just to confirm the figures, at the highest point in 1917, there were 118,000 Jews, 120,000, call it. Today we're under 50,000.
Can I add from the Australian perspective, there is a lot of discussion about people making aliyah. So, when the Zionist Federation of Australia holds its aliyah fair, the reports are that they're packed more than they've been before, and there are people moving. It's harder for a bunch of reasons. It's harder to measure the ins and out in incoming versus outgoing. But what we're finding, in addition to people leaving, is actually Israelis coming to Australia. And so we've kind of, population-wise, what David Graham, who's the kind of dean of demography, Jewish demography in Australia, he's basically saying we're probably plateauing now in terms of raw numbers of population because there aren't more major waves of immigration coming. But there are Israelis coming, and it's hard to know the extent to which it's one to one, people making Aliyah and Israelis coming to Australia. But yeah, there's definitely that sense of like bags packed. I'm hearing more of that. It's something we'll try and measure in some way in the Gen survey as well.
Thank you for that. I think we are on our last question, which is for all of you from Joshua. Is there an example of any society in the last 200 years that has successfully walked back from the precipice of growing anti-Semitism? Or do these trends inevitably point toward increasing polarization, isolation, discrimination, harassment, violence, and mass immigration? Whoever would like to go first.
I mean, in our case, not mass immigration, I wouldn't say, but certainly I mean, I think in lots of ways, anti-Semitism is symptomatic of bigger problems that we have. We always talk about anti-Semitism as the canary in the coal mine, but I think, Joshua, what you point to around polarization, particularly, and um, I think the promise of multiculturalism in Australia, we need to go back and start thinking about what that actually looks like. Um, solving anti-Semitism. I think I don't know if that's possible, but putting the genie back in the bottle at least in the Australian context has to also be part of a bigger discussion about just the general trends of racism, discrimination, violence, polarization. If I may just give a plug to my colleague, Canada's own Dan Heller. So I know we're with Yale, but I'm just looking at you, Ron, and you'd know Dan well. Dan's established a project called Brave Conversations. He's a historian of Polish Jews, but in the aftermath of October 7th, he became really interested in this question of polarization, and he's working with a colleague who's a neuropsychologist to try and understand exactly, like, where I'm looking at anti-Semitism, he's kind of approaching similar kinds of questions from a different angle, and that is like, what's this broader malaise in the ways that we can't actually, in say higher ed, have difficult conversations about the world's biggest challenges. And so, yes, I think walking back from the precipice is a challenge, but I'm sort of optimistic that we can move to a world where we do put that genie back in the bottle at least. But yeah, it's obviously a much older, deeper problem than any one of us individuals can solve.
Linda,
I would just say we've had a particular moment with Gaza. I mean, it's 2 years on the television screens, terrible optics, night after night across the world. And if that does lessen, things could walk back a little bit. And using the genie back in the bottle to a certain extent, it's possible.
Linda, I'm always afraid of being Pollyanna-ish because it doesn't suit my character. Um, and it certainly doesn't suit my home life where I complain all the time. But it seems to me, so in the Canadian context, I'll say we had quotas in, they were administrative quotas, but they were quotas in major Canadian universities, in our medical schools, in our law schools, that only ran out by the late 1960s, right? And so, and then there's, if I'm right, and it's a big if I'm right, that a lot of anti-Semitism now in the Canadian scene is being read by Jewish community members as nostalgia for the past, right? That's nostalgia for a brief past. And so I'd hope that there's actually an optimistic account in there that can say that if it's only been 60 odd years since the end of quotas and we can already have nostalgia for a past, that there is a way to put genies in bottles or take genies out of bottles or whatever one does with them. I'll only add, if it's useful to people online, Daniel Staetsky, who's a demographer of Jewish life at the European Jewish Demography Unit, has been trying to figure out whether Jewish migration out of places is a way for detecting democratic decline, right? And so he's been doing that work. Yale may choose to have him speak, but more importantly, people can also just go to the to his site where he's been developing a series of resources around how to think about that question and whether Jewish migration may be an indicator for democratic decline.
With that, we're at the end of our time. I want to thank our guests, Milton, David, and Ron. Thank you so much. This is actually the last event of Yale's year, and what a way to end. I never can say that I enjoy these events, but I always learn so much. It's disturbing, it's difficult, but as long as we're talking about walking back from the precipice, one of the things that gives me hope and encouragement is that we are all in this together. We do have allies. It might be a little more tenuous and difficult, but the fact that we can forge connections between South Africa, the United States, Australia, and Canada, that alone should help us to realize that none of us are alone in this fight. Thank you again for joining us. And for those of you who've been listening, thank you also for joining us. We hope that if you appreciated this event and would like to hear more, please go to our website for IPSA and sign up for our listserv, and we will have more events when we are back next fall. Thank you so much, everybody.